Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in Canada has yet again very recently shown just how anti-freedom and anti-democracy he actually is.
We have a robust functioning democracy, and public protests are an important part of making sure we're getting messages out there, and Canadians are getting messages out there and highlighting how they feel about various issues. But using protests to demand changes to public policy is something that I think is worrisome.
Okay. So here we have the Prime Minister of Canada saying that, yes, we have a highly functioning democracy and people's voices, the Canadian people's voices should be heard and they have the right and freedom to protest. However, if those protests are used to demand change in government policy, then no, that shouldn't be allowed. Just in that statement in and of itself, you got to wonder how this guy doesn't see the hypocrisy in his singular phrase. That freedom of...
That was former Hawaii Representative Tulsi Gabbard blasting the Canadian government's response to protests, which I know is a subject you've covered quite a bit, Batya, and you've brought on some great guests for us on Rising who have commented on how the Canadian government effectively tried to criminalize protest with regard to COVID policies, truckers, et cetera.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's just so funny for him to say we support protests, but not when they're demanding change. Like, what do you think protests are for? Like, what exactly do you support then? Just people marching and saying nothing? Like a silent... I mean, that's literally the purpose of protests. So if you're saying I only support protests where they don't demand change, you don't support protests, you don't support free speech. Of course, they don't have a First Amendment. They aren't the greatest country on earth. This is the greatest country on earth because we do have a First Amendment. But to me, Justin Trudeau is such a great example of how somebody who seems all nice and liberal and cuddly and says all the right things and is like, very aligned with liberalism is actually underneath a very thin veneer and patina of liberalism, somebody who doesn't really believe in it at all. And you really saw that with the truckers' convoy. I mean, they really exposed the kind of brutal dictatorial forces at play there. And it was just amazing how he instantly branded these freedom fighters, these people who were just out there doing a labor action to demand their right to work under conditions that they felt were comfortable and they supported, how he branded them as fascists for rejecting government overreach in terms of what you put in your body, right? There was so much projection going on there, and it just serves to underscore again and again how the left has one playbook. If you expose the class divide, if you talk about class, if you show them up for being authoritarian in any way, they will smear you as Nazis, as fascists. We know now that the one singular Nazi flag at the truckers' convoy was most likely a plant to undermine the whole thing. And the media in Canada, the leftist media here, Justin Trudeau, seized upon that one flag to demonize this entire group of people who were speaking up for freedom. It was just such a blatant display and such an important one. And my hat is really off to those people because the censure in Canada was unbearable. I mean, they really, because the Canadian media is so they don't have Fox News there, right? It's so solidly on the side of the government, and so much of the media takes money from the government. And it's very statist in nature. They were all smearing these people as Nazis who were, really, it was just a labor action at the end of the day.
Well, here's more from Tulsi. Let's watch.
So the latest example now here, again, of the hypocrisy coming from the Canadian government has to do with Jordan Peterson. Now, we've seen other examples before how Canada recently, they banned the sale of handguns. They don't believe in the right of individuals to defend themselves or their loved ones. We have seen also similarly how President Biden here in our own country has hinted at his desire to do the same. And so when we look at our own constitution, look at Canada's constitution, we see further and further infringement upon our God-given rights and freedoms. Now, Jordan Peterson is the latest victim of Canada's prosecution against free speech. He is being threatened by a government regulatory organization, the College of Psychologists, and they are threatening to take away his medical license unless he goes through retraining that is overseen by them and approved by them. And if he fails to do so, they will take away his license. And what was his offense? Well, he said some things that offended some people. He received a very threatening letter from the College of Psychologists. Jordan Peterson may have lacked professionalism in public statements made on social media and during a January 25th, 2022 podcast appearance, which happened to be on the Joe Rogan Experience. None of these complaints are coming from people who were medical patients or clients of Jordan Peterson. They're not coming from anyone that had anything to do with anyone who was a client or had any kind of acquaintance within his medical practice, which frankly has not been functioning for the last few years, simply because of the fact that since he became a publicly known figure, he has been under attack by these regulatory agencies and people who are critics of the things that he is saying.
Very interesting.
Yeah, so I will say, Jordan Peterson is going to be fine. He's not practicing anymore. He's become, a media personality, Daily Wire. He's doing very well. There are millions and millions and millions of other people who are not fine, who are routinely forced to take these kinds of trainings, forced to, affirm positions that they do not hold, that maybe violate their religious freedoms, who don't have Jordan Peterson's platform and who routinely are forced into this situation. And it's not okay. I mean, it's not acceptable that a very fringe ideology has taken hold of the licensing and the credentialing such that you either have to get on board with it or pretend that you're on board with it, or you cannot be part of the elites in that way. I think it's really, really problematic. And it's great that he's taking a stand on this. And in a way, it's almost good that this has happened to him because, otherwise you would never know about all of the doctors and, all the way down, teachers, cops, people, anybody who works and has to do these DEI trainings where they're forced to affirm things that they don't believe in order to keep their job. It really is something that deserves a lot more attention. What do you think, Robbie?
Well, and I will say, even his daughter joked when Elon Musk reinstated Jordan Peterson, let him back on Twitter. She joked that while I'm happy about this, I think my dad's too addicted to Twitter, so I wish there was some way to limit a little bit what he says. So I think that's some evidence that he's one of those individuals that falls into the too online category. And like you said, his free speech, thankfully, is not being meaningfully threatened by this because he has so many opportunities and platforms in which to speak to people and speak to people on psychological issues. But, the licensing part of this, and Canada is different from the U.S., the idea that they would come after his license or his right to practice because he said things that they thought were offensive on Twitter is pretty concerning. And that reminds me a little bit of actually a bill that was just defeated here in the U.S. California, wanted to criminalize COVID misinformation among doctors and had this horrible bill that was just deeply offensive on First Amendment grounds. And that bill was just thankfully struck down by a court because we do have the protections of the First Amendment here in the U.S. So I was happy to see that.
Absolutely. Yeah. So American viewers, we should be very grateful to live in the greatest country on earth.
Yes. More Rising right after this. Stay with us.